Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So in today's video, we are going to solve psychology's past paper. This is paper 2 from the first chapter, research methods. This paper is from May-June 2023. The paper's variant is 2-2 and it is for 1 hour 30 minutes. And also, I would like to mention that all the revenue generated for the first 6 months from making these past papers video will be generated to Palestine, inshallah. So please support our cause and do subscribe and share our channel. Moving on to the first question, it says, from the study by Yamamoto et al., suggest why it was necessary for the chimpanzees to examine and manipulate the tools before the experiment. We have marked the keywords over here, which is suggest, and what we have to suggest is why it was necessary for the chimpanzees to examine and manipulate the tools before the experiment. So it can be a very generic answer, in which you can write something like, so that the tools were familiar to the chimpanzees, otherwise they wouldn't have been able to decide which tool was useful for which problem. So they need to be familiarized with the tools. And since it is for 2 marks, so you have to give a detailed suggestion. You cannot just write that so that the tools were familiar to the chimpanzees. If you just write that, the first part of the sentence, you're going to get a partial mark for it. So you need to write the suggestion in detail. Then let's move on to second question. It says that Chloe is conducting a study to investigate classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Her aim is to test which type of conditioning produces the fastest learning, like whether the participants or people are able to learn fastest when they are when they are asked to learn something through classical conditioning or operant conditioning. And what we have to do is we have to write a non-directional two-tailed hypothesis for close study. You do not need to operationalize the variables in your hypothesis. So without operationalizing, we need to give them a non-directional hypothesis, and it is a very definitive thing that we should be knowing by now, that a non-directional hypothesis is the one in which there is no direction shown. It's like you are not telling that what impact will the independent variable have on the dependent variable. You are just mentioning that the independent variable will have some kind of impact on the dependent variable. For this purpose, for this question, we can write that there will be a difference in the learning speed between the tasks learned by operant and classical conditioning. So over here you are just mentioning that what independent variables do we have over here? The type of learning, either operant conditioning or your classical conditioning. So what we have to do is we just have to mention that there is going to be a difference when people are going to learn from operant conditioning versus classical conditioning. But what kind of difference will it be? If whether if they are going to learn better with operant conditioning or better with classical conditioning, we are not telling that. We are not telling the direction, the main difference. We are just telling that there is going to be some kind of difference between both kinds of learning, because we just needed to mention a non-directional hypothesis. Then question number 3 says that the study by Schechter and Singer investigated 2 factors in emotion. The participants in this study were deceived. So by now we should know that deceive is what? One of the ethical guidelines which should not be just a minute, I think I missed a question over here. I am so sorry. This is over here. And then we have another question, part B, which says closed results in the two conditions were the same. Explain why Chloe must reject her non-directional hypothesis, referring to her variables in your answer. So why should she reject her hypothesis? Because the thing is that there was no difference between her results, right? But our hypothesis says that there was some kind of a difference between the learning. So we need to say that operant conditioning was not faster than the classical conditioning or vice versa, because none of them was the fastest, both of them were the same. So neither was operant conditioning faster than the classical conditioning, nor was the classical conditioning faster than the operant conditioning. Then the next question was the deceived one. So I was saying that it says the participants in this study were deceived, and deceived is one of the ethical guidelines which should not be broken while conducting a study. Now what we have to do is we need to outline one way that the participants were deceived in this study. We just have to outline one way, but it is for 2 marks, so we need to outline the way with the details that it should be linked with the study. So we can write that the participants thought that the stooge was another participant. So you are just outlining it, but now you're giving the details. But he was there as a confederate of the experimenter to create conditions of euphoria and anger. So you outline the way and then you also give details for it. Okay, then it says explain why the deception that you outlined in A1 was necessary. So you need to explain it. So it is for 2 marks. So you are going to get 1 mark for explanation and 1 mark for the detail to earn full marks. Okay. So what we can write is it was done to avoid demand characteristics, because if the participants had known the role of the stooge, he would not have affected their modes. Because if the participants had known that it was a stooge and not another participant, and they would have known his role, that he is there to create such kind of situation, so they would not have been impacted by the euphoria or the anger situation that was being created, because they would have known that this is the tactics the experimenter is using. So they would have a better control over their emotions and the results would not have been valid. So it was necessary to deceive the participants. And then the question says, Sector and Singer reported that in one condition, the observer could not hear the spoken reactions for one participant. State one practical reason why this was a problem. You just need to state it for 1 mark. So what it can be, you can write simply that they had less data for that condition, which means incomplete information was gathered for that condition. Okay, because obviously they were not able to hear the participant in that observation, so they were not able to record that data, which might have resulted in less of the data. Okay, then question number 4 says the data from experiment 1 in the study by Laney et al. False memory is given in table 4.1. We have to draw a bar chart for week 2 data only. You must label the axis. We just have to draw the bar graph for week 2. Okay, so as the question says that we also need to label the axis, so by now we should be knowing that our independent variable is always on the x-axis and our dependent variable is on the y-axis. So over here our independent variable is the condition, and then we have the mean rating for critical item on the y-axis. And now we need to draw the bar graph. So what we can do is we need to see the data from week 2. It says that we have two conditions. Just a minute. Okay, 2.5 and 4.5. Okay, so control condition, let's say this is your 2.5. And this is your control condition. And then we have 4.5, let's say over here. This is your love condition. So you're just going to mark it. You can color it if you want. Or if the lines are prominent without coloring, then leave it as it is. So this can be your data. Okay. Then moving on to the next question, it says, state one conclusion about this study using the data in table 4.1. So now again we have to refer to the whole table, week 1 and week 2. And over here we need to state one conclusion for 1 mark. So we just simply need to state one general conclusion. And what we can see from the data is that the critical item in the love group changed the belief of the participants because they loved the asparagus more in week 2. Because in week 1 their data was 1.7 for the love group, and then it was 4.2 for week 2. So we can clearly see that their beliefs were changed. They started to like asparagus. They started to believe that they liked asparagus as a child. And then we have question 5. It says, explain the importance of inter-observer reliability in the study by Bandura et al. So see, in such questions, what we have to do in paper 2 from research methods, we need to write a normal importance of the thing that is given. Like for example, we will just be mentioning the general importance of inter-observer reliability, and then for the second mark, we are going to link it with the study by Bandura. So let me just write it over here. For example, you can write, it gives consistency between two observers. And why is it important? So that now link it with the study of Bandura, so that the teacher and the researcher rated the same, or you can also write researcher gave the same ratings to the students aggression, so that the results can be reliable, because they can cross-check their results. Okay, then question number 6, what we have to do, we have to describe the use of controls in laboratory experiment and field experiment using any examples from this study. And if it's for 6 marks, you have to give a definition, a detailed definition of what it means by controls in laboratory experiments and in field experiment. And then you also have to give examples for both for each of them, for controls in laboratory experiment and controls in fields experiment, to gain full marks. So if I'm to write an answer for this one, we can write, let's say, controls are the ways to limit the effect of extraneous variables. to ensure that the level of independent variable is alone the factor impacting the dependent variable, so that there is no other factor which can impact the dependent variable, so that we can be sure that it is our manipulation of the independent variable which is changing the measurements of the dV. And then moving forward, we can write about controls in lab experiment. We can write about it. So if I'm to write the answer to this question, I can write, first of all, I have to explain what controls are. So controls are the ways to limit the effect of extraneous variables to ensure that only the level of independent variable is the factor impacting the dependent variable, so that we know that it is only the manipulation of our independent variable which is causing the difference and in the measurement of the dependent variable, and there is no other extraneous variable which can impact our dV. And then further, I have to write how controls are used in the lab experiment, in the laboratory experiment. So controls in lab experiments are easier to implement as compared to the field experiment, because the environment in the lab experiment is artificial it is set up by the researcher and can be altered according to their needs. For example, Bandura exposed every child to the same staged start of the model potato printing, so that all of them were exposed to the same condition, so that they can know that it wasn't the difference in the staged condition which can cause any kind of difference. So they controlled that extraneous variable. And then controls in field experiment, you can talk about that controls in field experiment are harder to implement compared to a lab experiment, because the environment already exists naturally and it is not set up by the researcher and it cannot be altered to a great extent. Okay, and then for the example, you can write about Pilyavin because it was a fields experiment. Pilyavin could not control the mood of the participant it was just the type of the victim which could be controlled by Pilyavin, but not the moods of the participant. So this can give you a whole 6 mark for this. And then moving on to the next question, it says Darren is planning an experimental study to compare how and how often men and women look at themselves in a shop window. she plans to collect quantitative data using observations and will calculate a median. Identify the independent variable in Darren's study. So for this, we again need to read the prompt, read it carefully, and then identify the independent variable from the study. She is saying that she wants to study to compare how and how often men and women look at themselves in a shop window. She plans to collect quantitative data using observations and will calculate median. So if she is saying that she needs to compare how often men and women look at themselves, so over here, your independent variable is going to be the gender. And then now we have to identify identify one dependent variable in Darren's study. So for this, if we know that from the prompt, we know that she is studying to compare how and how often men and women look at themselves in a shop window. So over here, we just need to identify one dependent variable. So you can either write how often men and women look at themselves in a shop window. Or you can also write time spent in front of windows or something like that. And now we have to identify the experimental design used in Darren's study. So we know that she is saying that she needs to compare how and how often men and women look at themselves. So obviously in one group you are going to have males, and in the other group you are going to have females. So this is the independent measures group or independent measures design. Independent measures design. Okay, and now we have to suggest how Darren could use a structured observation in her study, and it is for 3 marks. So we need to mention how she can use a structured observation, and the response should be linking to looking in a shop window to gain full marks. So structured observation is something in which we already have the specific criteria of behavior. We have the specific criteria or specific behaviors listed down, which can be categorized as looking yourself in the window. So structures, we also need to mention what structured observations are. So structured observations list specific behaviors to record. Okay, or you can also write that structured observations have list of specific behaviors that can be categorized as your dependent variable, and then the observer checklists the frequency of those behaviors which they already have listed down. And in this, for example, Darren would need to follow each participant, and then where is she going to follow them? Through the shopping center, and tally each time they look in a shop window. And how is she going to categorize it? Like if they are looking at themselves, so you can also write windows such as if they paused to look at their reflection, okay, if they're pausing to look at themselves, that can be counted as looking yourself in the mirror. And then you have to suggest one disadvantage of using a structured observation compared to an unstructured observation. So you need to compare both of the disadvantage of a structured observation with unstructured observation, and you're going to get 1 mark for just naming the disadvantage, and the second mark for linking it with the study. So you can write that it may be hard to count individual behavior, or you can write or to separate the behavioral streams into individual actions. For example, it can be difficult to know if it was a long look or a short glance. She cannot basically differentiate if the participant was looking at themselves for a longer time or it was just a short glance. Okay, so moving on to part C, it says a measure of central tendency is a method of data analysis. Now you have to explain why the median is a measure of central tendency. They have given the definition of central tendency over here, that it is a measure, it is a method of data analysis. So now you basically have to tell that why is median considered a method of data analysis. So we know that median tells us the middle value. So we can just write that it is a measure of central tendency because it tells the middle score. So that is that. And then suggest one strength of using. You just have to suggest one strength of using one method of data analysis other than the median with Darren's study. So what she can use instead of median, we have other two methods of central tendency, which are mode and mean. So you can use either of that. You are going to get 1 mark for identifying an appropriate method of data analysis other than median, which can either be your mode or mean, and then you will get 1 mark for linking the strength of that method with Darren's study. So let's say I can write the mean, and this will take into account the frequency of looking in the shop windows for each participant. So this is how mean can be a good measure. And then question number 8 says Phyllis is planning a correlational study. So Phyllis is planning a correlational study to investigate the relationship between vocabulary size and level of education. You have to suggest 2 ways that Phyllis could measure vocabulary size. So they can be general. You are going to get, like, it's for 4 marks, so you are going to get 1 mark for suggesting and 1 mark for giving details. So 2 marks per suggestion. And then we can write that first way can be that set a vocabulary test of words to remember. This is a suggestion. And then count how many times a participant gets them right. So this is the detail of your first suggestion. So 2 marks you can get over here. And then the second suggestion can be give them a passage to translate. This is your suggestion. And then see how many of the unusual words they know. The ones that are not usually typically translated in a normal language, in a normal conversation. How many of such words can the participant translate? So these are the details. And then it says for one of the way you have suggested in A1, suggest one strength of measuring vocabulary size in this way. So you can choose either of them. And for example, I am using the test one, the first suggestion. So I can write that a test is more objective then an estimate of the range of words used. For example, they cannot pretend that they do not know a word. It is a very objective thing. You can easily get to know that if the participant is able to remember or not. They cannot pretend that they know or do not know, because it is there. Their score is right there in front of you in the form of scores. And then you have to suggest one way that Phyllis could measure the level of education. So basically, you need to operationalize what a level of education can look like. So maybe you can write that number of years in education. For example, someone has had 12 years of education, someone has had 20 years or whatever, so that can be counted as the level of education. Or you can also write if they have any qualification or not. For example, if someone has an A-levels degree, if someone has a bachelor's degree, if they have a higher level of education, like that you can operationalize it. And then we have Phyllis expects to find a positive correlation. We know that by now. A positive correlation is what? When both the variables move in the same direction. If you have a problem remembering these technical words, what you can do is just take a breather, take 2 minutes, take 2 seconds, or whatever time you are needing just to understand the keyword, outline it, underline it, whatever, circle it, and then just write down its definition so that you do not forget it when you are answering the question. And then what we have is outline what Phyllis would conclude if she could find the results in 8.1. So if the results look like this, level of education and vocabulary, we can see that it is a negative correlation, because she expected to find a positive correlation in which both the variables move in the same direction. But over here, what is happening is your vocabulary size is over here. And for example, this is your level of education. So for the x-axis, you move like here, and for the y-axis you move upwards. So over here we can see that as the level of education increased, the vocabulary size decreased. Because let's say if this is 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and over here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So when the level of education is at 1, the vocabulary is at 5, and when the education level is at 5, the vocabulary is at 1. So this is how we can say that it is a negative correlation that Phyllis found in her study. Then part 2 says outline what Phyllis would conclude if she found the results in 8.2. So in the next part it says outline what Phyllis would conclude if she found the results in figure 8.2. And over here we can see that all of the points are very scattered, so there is no correlation found. No correlation. Or you can also write or no link found. And then question number 9 says, James is planning a study and has chosen to use opportunity sampling to find participants. A friend says he should use random sampling instead. Another friend says that sample size is just as important as sampling technique. Explain one strength of using opportunity sampling. So you just have to mention a general strength of opportunity sampling that we have learned in chapter 1. So it is that opportunity sampling is easy. It is easy and takes less time. So why is it so? This is because you have to mention the detail, forget the 2 marks. So this is because he can select the participants who are readily available. They just happen to be there, readily available nearby, and he doesn't need to search for them, which might take a lot more time. And then in part C you have to explain why a larger sample may be better. Just a minute. Okay. In part B, you have to explain one advantage of using random sampling instead of opportunity sampling. So here you need to mention one advantage of random sampling and then compare it with opportunity sampling to get a better marker answer. So it will be more representative and the findings will be more generalizable. This is because the participants are more likely to have a range of characteristics and this is not really possible in opportunity sampling. Because you see, when you are conducting the research through opportunity sampling, you're recruiting your sample through opportunity sampling. So there is a chance that when you are choosing the people who just happen to be there, they might have the same characteristics. Because if you're talking about a certain shop, a certain mall, so there might be people with the same characteristics who like that particular product they're buying and all of that. So they have the same preferences, and it doesn't allow for generalizability because there's a risk of cultural bias. And then we have part C, which says that explain why a larger sample may be better than a smaller sample. So it is again a very generic answer that larger sample allows for more generalization, and the results can be applied to a wider population. And then question number 10 says that parent is going to interview participants about their dream. He is going to interview the participants about their dreams. He wants to collect information about the duration and content of the dreams in children and adults. Describe how parent could conduct a study using an interview to investigate the duration and content of dreams in children and adults. So over here, his independent variables are children and adults because he is going to compare the results for them. So again, what are the basic parts? The what, why, how, who, and where. So if we go with the structure, so what are we going to conduct over here? We are going to conduct an interview. So parent would conduct an interview using, maybe when we're talking about the who part, we also need to mention that how is that sample going to be recruited. So using volunteer sampling, we can use that volunteer sampling. And then I'm just writing down simple points. You can obviously you will have to make full proper paragraphs and sentences with it. How can he use a volunteer sampling? He can put Edwards in a parents club, parents and children club, or in a school, whatever you would like, you can write about that. And then you can write, where did that go? Okay. Put Edwards in parents and children club or in a school. How many participants? For example, let's say 50 participants. Okay, 50 participants we have. And then we can write that he can conduct a structured interview, like the how part. So over here we are going to write the structured. This is basically the procedure, structured interviews, where he has pre-planned questions. And while you are writing about the questions, you also need to mention that what kind of questions he can ask. So maybe he can have different interviews for both children and adult, because both of them are different. The children might need the interviewer to be more friendly, to be more frank. They need to be familiar with them. So he can have different interviews structured for both the groups, adults and children. For example, what are the main questions he can ask? For example, the main questions he can ask from both the groups can be such as, for how much time do you think you dream? And you can also ask that how often do you get dreams at night? And then he can ask that if most of your dreams are scary or not, content of the dream. Okay, and then after this he can compare the results for both the groups. And since it is a self-report, so it is going to give you high validity and in-depth data. You can write that later on, the questions which are already structured, a parent can make a statistical analysis for that, because he can make bar graphs for the structured interviews. For example, content of the dream on the x-axis and the frequency of watching that certain content on the y-axis. Okay, so that is how he can conduct the whole experiment. And you need to also mention that where is that study being conducted, maybe in the same school or maybe in the same club from where he recruited his participants, and for how much time will this study continue, so it can continue for 1 day or something like that. Okay, and then you need to identify one practical weakness limitation with the procedure you have described in your answer to part A, and suggest how your study might be done differently to overcome the problem. And you do not need to refer to the ethics or sampling in your answer. You just need to mention the procedure's weakness. So maybe it can be that the children might not understand the questions or the procedure of the interview, which can result in the distortion of results, as they are not able to answer properly because they do not understand the questions or the procedure of the interview. And to overcome this problem, parent can do what? If they are not able to understand the procedure, parent can ask the parents of the children to inform them about the procedure and make them understand it beforehand, so they do not have any confusion and they're clear about it. So this is it for this paper. I hope everything is clear to you guys.